You think Google invented the network effect? Think again. Before there was code, there was the cog. Before algorithms, there were alliances. The most powerful tech cartel in history wasn't born in a California garage. It was forged in the freezing waters of the North Sea by merchants who controlled the flow of information, goods, and power with an iron fist. They didn't have an army, a king, or even a country, but they could bring nations to their knees. This is the story of the Hanseatic League, the original global network that wrote the playbook for Silicon Valley 700 years before the first computer was ever built.
So, how did it all start? Not with a grand vision, but with a simple, brutal problem: piracy. In the 12th century, sailing the Baltic was a death sentence. To survive, merchant cities like Lübeck and Hamburg made a pact, a simple agreement for mutual defense. But what began as a security alliance quickly morphed into something far more ambitious. They realized the real money wasn't just in selling herring or timber. The real power was in controlling the entire system, the platform itself. They didn't just want to be players in the game. They wanted to own the game board, write the rules, and be the referee. And if you're finding this hidden history fascinating, consider subscribing. We dig into stories like this every week, showing how the past is never really past.
To control the network, you need nodes. For the Hanseatic League, these were the contours. Think of them less as offices and more as heavily fortified economic embassies or even medieval app stores. They had 4 major ones in London, Bruges, Bergen, and Novgorod. These weren't just warehouses, they were self-contained worlds operating under German law on foreign soil. Local merchants couldn't just trade with the Hansa, they had to go through the contour. They had to abide by Hansa rules, use Hansa weights and measures, and accept Hansa justice. It was a closed ecosystem. The League controlled the entry points, just like Apple controls who gets on the App Store. You either played by their rules or you didn't play at all.
What's the secret to scaling a network? Standardization. Microsoft did it with Windows. The Hansa did it with everything else. They standardized shipbuilding, creating the cog, a sturdy flat-bottomed vessel that was the cargo container of its day. They standardized trade laws, so a contract signed in Riga was enforceable in London. They even standardized currency and accounting practices. This was their operating system. It reduced friction, increased efficiency, and made their network incredibly sticky. Once you were part of the Hansa system, it was simply too costly and complicated to leave. You were locked in. Your entire business was built on their OS, and they could revoke your license at any time.
The League's most valuable commodity wasn't salt or fur, it was information. In an age where news traveled at the speed of a horse, the Hansa's network of merchants and contours was a superhighway of data. They knew which ports were backed up, where grain prices were about to spike, and which kings were on the verge of bankruptcy. This information asymmetry gave them a staggering advantage in negotiations. They could predict market shifts weeks or months in advance. It was the medieval equivalent of high-frequency trading. While a local English merchant only knew the price of wool in his own town, the Hansa merchant knew its price across 20 cities. Who do you think got the better deal?
Every dominant platform controls access to something essential. For Facebook, it's the social graph. For the Hanseatic League, it was the raw materials of civilization. They established a near-total monopoly on the salt from Lüneburg, which was the only way to preserve food, especially fish. They controlled the massive timber and grain exports from the Baltic states, which were needed to build ships and feed the growing cities of Western Europe. And they dominated the Scandinavian herring trade, a primary source of protein for much of the continent. By locking down the supply of these fundamental resources, they could dictate terms to anyone, even kings. So, what happened when someone challenged the cartel? They didn't just sue them in court, they went to war. The most famous example was their conflict with the Kingdom of Denmark. In the 1360s, King Valdemar IV tried to break the League's stranglehold on the herring trade. The League's response was swift and brutal. They didn't have a state army, so they pooled their money, hired mercenaries, and built a massive war fleet. They blockaded Danish ports, crippling their economy. They sacked Copenhagen. In the end, the king was forced to sign the Treaty of Stralsund, a humiliating defeat. The treaty gave the Hansa a veto over the Danish royal succession and 15% of all Danish trade revenues. Imagine Amazon being able to decide who becomes the next Prime Minister of the UK. That was the level of power they wielded.
For cities within the network, the greatest threat wasn't war. It was being kicked off the platform. The League could and did impose an embargo on any city or kingdom that defied its rules. This was the medieval version of being deplatformed. All Hanseatic merchants would be ordered to leave. All trade would cease. For a city whose economy depended on the League's network, this was an economic death sentence. Their markets would dry up, their craftsmen would have no materials, and their people would starve. The city of Bruges, once the jewel of European trade, learned this the hard way when they tried to challenge the League's privileges. The Hansa simply moved their main contour to Antwerp, and Bruges began a long, slow decline. The message was clear: the network gives, and the network can take away.
Who made these life-or-death decisions? Not a king or emperor. The League was governed by the Hansatag, or Hanseatic Diet. This was a regular assembly of delegates from the member cities, usually held in Lübeck, the unofficial capital. It was essentially a corporate board meeting for Northern Europe. They would set policy, resolve disputes between members, declare embargoes, and plan wars. There was no constitution, no formal voting procedure. Decisions were made through consensus and immense peer pressure, led by the most powerful cities. It was a fluid, adaptable, and utterly ruthless form of governance, driven by one single principle: profit. To be a Hanseatic merchant was to be part of an exclusive club with immense privileges and strict obligations. They were a cosmopolitan elite, speaking multiple languages and spending years abroad in the contours. But their lives were harsh and disciplined. Apprenticeships were long and demanding. In places like the Contour in Bergen, they lived in a tightly controlled all-male community, forbidden from fraternizing with the locals to prevent trade secrets from leaking. They were expected to contribute to the common defense and obey the edicts of the Diet without question. The reward for this loyalty was access to a network that offered unparalleled wealth and protection, making them the merchant princes of their age.
Like any great empire or any dominant corporation, the Hanseatic League's greatest threat eventually came from within. The cartel only worked as long as everyone agreed that their collective interest was more important than their individual interests. But as the centuries passed, the goals of the member cities began to diverge. Western cities like Cologne became more interested in trade with England and Flanders, while eastern cities like Danzig and Riga were focused on the vast resources of the Baltic. Lübeck, the traditional leader, tried to maintain the old, rigid monopolies, while other cities wanted more flexibility. The consensus that had been their greatest strength began to fracture.
While the League was arguing internally, the world outside was changing. The fragmented feudal landscape was consolidating into powerful nation-states. Kings and queens in England, France, Sweden, and Russia were centralizing power. They built their own navies, chartered their own trading companies, and were no longer willing to tolerate a foreign corporate entity controlling their economies and operating outside their laws. In 1598, Queen Elizabeth I expelled the Hanseatic merchants from London, closing their contour for good. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible had already done the same in Novgorod. The age of the Merchant League was ending. The age of the nation-state had begun.
And then came the ultimate disruption. The discovery of new sea routes and the New World shifted the entire center of global trade from the Baltic and North Seas to the Atlantic Ocean. The old trade in herring and timber, while still important, was dwarfed by the immense wealth of silver, sugar, and spices flowing in from the Americas and Asia.
New players, like the Dutch and the English, with more advanced ships and more aggressive, state-backed capitalist models, rose to prominence. The Hanseatic League, slow to adapt and stuck in its old ways, was simply outmaneuvered. Their network, once the center of the world, had become a regional backwater. There was no single moment the Hanseatic League died. There was no final battle or dramatic collapse. It was a long, slow fade into irrelevance. The last formal Hanseatic Diet was held in 1669, with only a few cities bothering to send representatives. The great cartel that had dominated Europe for centuries just fizzled out. Its legacy, however, is encoded in the DNA of modern business. The brick Gothic architecture in cities across Northern Europe stands as a silent testament to their power. But their true legacy is invisible. It's the idea of the closed ecosystem, the platform lock-in, the power of the network effect. It's the strategy of controlling choke points, whether it's a strait in the Baltic Sea or a search engine's front page. It's the use of standardization to create a moat around your business. When a tech giant uses its dominance in one market, like an operating system, to push its products in another, like a web browser, they are using the Hanseatic playbook. When a company creates a platform where leaving is almost unthinkable because your entire digital life is built on it, that is the ghost of the Hanse at work. They proved a fundamental truth. Power doesn't always come from the sword or the crown. Often, it comes from the ledger, the contract, and control of the network.
The Hanseatic League may be gone, but the model they created is more powerful than ever. The names have changed from Lübeck and Hamburg to Apple and Amazon, but the principles remain the same. Control the network, and you control the world. The first tech cartel wasn't in Silicon Valley because the technology isn't the point. It's the system, and that system is timeless. What do you think? Are today's tech giants just a modern version of the Hanseatic League? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.